Good afternoon. Hopefully everyone enjoyed lunch today. So in the spirit of my good friend Tom D. Haas, Iron told Carbon a joke so funny, he decided to steal it. So we are talking about climate and carbon, and this afternoon we start off with Mike Eastat, 33 years? 30, somewhere in that neighborhood, OSU Extension educator from Pickaway County. Mike's going to be talking about soil carbon marketing opportunities for farmers. So Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Aaron, and thanks to the committee for the invitation back. So I guess I didn't make a lot of people mad last year, so maybe I'll make them mad this year. So if you were here last year, you're going to see a couple slides in here that you might have seen, but I have updated it. So we're going to talk a little bit about, and I've kind of changed the topic, are you ready for carbon programs? Because I really don't know if markets really describe what's happening out there as far as the private and government push to have you all do things different on your farms in the name of carbon sequestration and slowing down the amount of greenhouse gases being emitted to the atmosphere. So I kind of think more of them as a program, and that's my contact information. If you want to drop me an email, that's fine, and we can talk about things. But I kept this slide in only because I used this at a talk in West Palm Beach, Florida this summer at a National Ag Agents meeting. And a lady literally stopped me, and she goes, "Oh my God, I know Becky Grubbs Bowling." Well, I pulled this off of Twitter because I think it really kind of epitomizes the county. We're a state extension specialist. And she made me stop my presentation, and I had to stand in front of my slide, and she's literally texting Becky about a county agent from Pickaway County that used her Twitter feed. So again, I think I might have just slid over into Joe Exotic there a little bit. Sorry. So just kind of a word map. These are some of the words that if you've been following carbon and carbon programs in the last 2 years, you see a lot of those common words and things that you might have heard here today as far as regenerative ag and cover crops and some other ones. But I have added some new words in there, so it kind of might give you a little bit of a preview of the slides to come. And we think about right now we're going through a farm bill testimony, and we have recently passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which will have a lot of things that will be discussed here in a few minutes. So what has brought us up to this point? Well, we have mandatory emissions. These aren't new. This about a 25, 30 years. The state of California has probably been one of the bigger ones. The California Emissions Board, they pretty much put methane digesters in all the dairy farms in the Central Valley of California in order to reduce the amount of methane being emitted. I was in western Iowa last year. The state of California is putting methane digesters on hog barns, generating electricity and sending it back to California. So again, we know that utilities were under emissions caps, and so we also know there are federal and state mandates associated with emissions. But more recently, the whole gamut of voluntary emissions reductions, we may have heard really the first major one was the Paris Accord that came out during the Obama administration, where nations have started to take net neutral carbon pledges and understand it is what it is, a pledge. It's not signed in blood. But more recently, Security and Exchange Commission, there's discussion that companies that are traded on the exchange will file reports that report the amount of carbon emissions their companies are responsible for. I know as far as it affects ag, there's been discussion with a lot of the ag commodity groups, and the American Farm Bureau are wanting to, maybe exempt you down on the land from that because it's just another layer of very complicated record keeping that you would have to do. But we will talk a little bit about how other companies may be asking you to keep track of your emissions. And then the big one is environmental and social governance. And we'll get into that one with a little more detail too. But that's what got us to this point today. A little bit about the United Nations framework on climate change, and Aaron Wilson and I, we went around a lot last winter talking about, kind of the push here. 2 years ago, the conference was in Glasgow, Scotland, and the big buzzword that came out of Scotland was methane, and so I know the United States signed on to programs that would reduce the amount of methane emission coming off of basically there are three major sources of methane. We always kind of think about the cow burps, right? That's the first one. Well, landfills are another great source of methane, and oil and gas exploration. So those are your three major sources of methane here. And then this past year, they were in Egypt. Two major things really came out, as I followed it, was developing countries that are affected by climate change are asking the developed countries to basically give them a fund that they can generate, pull money from in order to combat the effects of rising seawater and stronger storms and things like that. But there was a whole day there in Egypt devoted to agriculture. They actually had their own pavilion. I know Fred Yoder, we all know who Fred is. Fred was part of that Solutions from the Land team that spent a day talking about ag's story and how ag can be seen as a source of mediation instead of making the problems worse. And I just thought I always get a good, interesting reaction to this slide when we talk a little bit about methane. These are just some examples. I talked a little bit about digesters. This is a methane digester. One picture here from Ireland where they're doing research, and that is literally a methane collector here at the mouth of the cow, and methane is actually collected on the tanks that are strapped to the cow's back. The picture up here in the upper left is from a dairy in New Zealand. There's actually a methane detector in that plastic flap that when it detects methane, a small spark ignites the methane right at the cow. So, and this is kind of where things are at now. Methane, there's a lot of work being done on feed additives. Red algae is one of them that shows a lot of promise on actually changing the flora of the gut, so you don't have as much methane produced in the rumen. There's some work on vaccinations too. So the only problem I have with it is it's really easy to do some of this stuff in a confined animal operation, right? We see our cows every day. About 90% of all the bovines in the world are free range. We don't see them every day. Oh, you might have read in the news about Dutch farmers protesting their government's decree that they're going to reduce nitrous oxide emissions by 33%. Or that's wrong. They just want to reduce their nitrous oxide emissions. As a result, about 33% of the farmers in the Netherlands would pretty much have to be shut down. So Dutch farmers showed their displeasure to their politicians. So think a little bit about carbon programs and what they're based upon. Two things: practices adopted and outcomes achieved. And so what is the difference? Anyone want to venture a guess? What's the difference between a carbon program where a farmer adopts a practice or a carbon program where outcomes are achieved? Go ahead.
Practice adoption is quantifiable, it's guaranteed, outcomes are going to be a function of the model position of the practice adopted, so there's more risk associated.
Which results in what? The amount of money the farmer gets. These programs here, practices adopted, there's a lot of them. $3 for no-till, $6 for cover crops. Annual, not much record keeping, you just say you did it. Someone's going to write you a check for $3 an acre. Outcomes achieved, you're right. There's going to be a lot more data shared. There's going to be an algorithm that's going to try to predict with some accuracy the amount of carbon that's either sequestered in your soils or the amount of reduction in greenhouse gases that you have accounted for. And the more work you put into something, the more you should get paid. So the real difference is how much you get in the end. You know, offsets are just basically tradable certificates. Basically what you do is you sequester a carbon for somebody who doesn't want to reduce their emission. Okay? So an emitter is going to pay you to take that greenhouse gas and either you reduce your amount of carbon footprint or you put carbon in soil. And they are tradable. So we'll talk about a little bit about prices, but anyone know what the current price for a ton of carbon United States average with some of the companies that are out there? Pretty close. It was 25 last year when I was here. A couple of the companies are around 45 now. Anyone want to guess what the price of a carbon credit in Europe is today? It's about 100 euros. So, you know, Europe's way ahead of us on this. I use this slide again, but if you weren't here last year, I was going to go to Milwaukee for a meeting. I decided, hey, let's be environmental, just figure out what my carbon footprint is, and let's see if I can offset it. So I went in, just did a Google search on carbon offsets, came up with a company called 8 Billion Trees. I put in my flight. They calculated that I was going to be responsible for roughly 200 pounds of carbon emitted on that flight. So I went ahead and clicked offset my flight emission. Got a page that came up, wanted my credit card information. My cost was about $7 to offset my carbon. Now they were going to plant some trees somewhere on this globe with that $7 that I was going to give them, right? Now, somewhere. Now, like anything else, you should always read that fine print, right? Down in the little box down at the very end, and the font was really, really small, is that unless I opted out, I was going to get charged $7.91 every month. Okay? So there's a lot of discussion about offset markets and companies that are promoting offsets. And there's a lot of folks that are looking into projects now and saying, well, so-and-so bought all the carbon credits from the nature preserve in Brazil, and it was already a preserve, and it was never going to be harvested. Why are they getting to sell carbon credits off something that was never going to be, was going to be in perpetuity? So there's a lot of discussion about that. Just real quick, like I said, about 46% of all the carbon credits sold right now are in forestry. Ag is about, this is a little bit dated slide, it's about 2%. About 2% of all the carbon credits sold are related to ag. But if you read the general press, it does look like a lot of interest in credits in the years to come. You know, 2050 is the date a lot of the companies want to use to be net carbon neutral. So again, you know, with people like Goldman Sachs and other folks that are looking at and making big investments. Inserts. And so inserts, I'm going to talk more about those because I think that's where ag's going to really have an opportunity. It's where basically we look at scope 3 emissions. And does anyone really know what a scope 3 emission is? Well, scope 3 is looking at your supply chain. And I'm going to use a prop, you know, okay? So I'm going to use a Hershey's dark chocolate bar. So Hershey's, this chocolate bar, about 10% of the carbon emissions in this chocolate bar is in the manufacturing of the bar and the wrapper, about 10%. Another 20% is its distribution through the value chain. So it's about 70% of the carbon is actually due to the deforestation of the farmers that are taking out the rainforest to plant their cacao plants. So so Hershey's wants to reduce the amount of scope 3 emissions. And so they look at projects with their farmers and their suppliers. to try to, again, reduce the carbon footprint.
So is that 70% that's
That's Scope
Scope 3?
3. Scope 2 emissions, if you're interested, Scope 2 would be the amount of emissions associated with like the electricity they use in the plant, the fuel in their trucks. This is just a picture of a quart of orange juice from Europe. Again, actually giving the amount of CO2 that was emitted as a result of this quart of orange juice. The problem with that is there is no standardized equation of all these companies. They're just using their own algorithm, their own equation to determine the amount of CO2 that's being emitted. So again, it's really not being able to compare orange juice to apple juice, I guess. If you're really interested in understanding why these companies, there's a web page here that's called the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about ESG. And so what this is a 501c3. Its membership is made up of investment and asset managers. And this particular 501c3, its board and its members control about $14 trillion, or manage $14 trillion. So when we think about that, investors are the ones that are kind of pushing and demanding that we consider the environmental and social impact of our investments. Now, I know some states around the United States have told, they're like their pension funds. I know Texas is one of the states that we want to pull our money back out of firms that are ESG prioritizing. But things like this we see in the store. This is the picture I took at Whole Foods in Columbus. This is carbon neutral milk. This milk fights climate change. So they do have investors. That particular company, LeBron James, Mark Cuban, and Bill Gates are backing this company. Low Carbon Beef, company out of San Antonio, Texas, working with grazers and cattlemen to produce a low carbon beef. Anyone know what this is a picture of? It's a sailboat, right. This is actually an ocean-going freighter, and it could be carrying Ohio soybeans as far as we know. But in order for everybody, the end users, and wherever that might be, again, we're trying to reduce the amount of fuel being used to push the beans to China. This isn't, I didn't Photoshop this. This is a Michelin product. So they inflate the sail, and when they come into the harbor, they deflate the sail so that everybody at the end users can take a partial credit for reduced fossil fuel use. Current brokers and buyers, that's a slide I've used a lot. You can see some of these names you might be familiar with. I just found out I've got friends in Pickaway County that have sold carbon credits with the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund. Anyone familiar with them? Yeah, they're a subsidiary of the Iowa Soybean Council Board. So they've decided. Anyone know Yara? Anyone know Yara? Scandinavian fertilizer and chemical producers. But there's names up there you're familiar with. And I'm going to highlight ESMC here in a second because I think this is a slide you need to study just a little bit as it relates to agriculture. This is, again, a 501c3. It's kind of major companies, NRCS, USDA, General Mills, United Soybean Board. You can find a lot of those. Foundation of Farm and Agricultural Research, which is a USDA NIFA foundation. But when you start really studying that, all those logos up there, there's a lot of ag logos. I see Corteva and Nutrien and Cargill, ADM, Syngenta. But what I also see are a lot of food companies. Nestle, General Mills, Tyson, Mars, McDonald's, Benson Hill, which is into non-GMO and organic grains, the Almond Board. The one I want to talk, give you an example, PepsiCo. PepsiCo is really interesting. They own quite a few different brands. Of course, the Tropicana, Quaker, Gatorade, but Lay's potato chips. That's where their first real big effort on carbon insets have went. They are working with 8,000 potato growers around the world, working with them to reduce the amount of carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. So probably less spraying, less tillage, less irrigation if they can. But that company is really dedicated toward net zero. But again, there's a lot of different players here. Danone here in Ohio, Western Ohio. If you're, Coldwater or Minster is where the plant is. So they're working with dairy farmers and doing things like cover crops and no-till and things like that. So again, someone right here in Ohio. Questions up to this point? I always like to stop for a second. Okay. So I've had a few slides here as we've got some new information. The first one I want to talk about is the Inflation Reduction Act. And I guess my disclaimer here is you don't have to agree. You don't need to be a climate denier or a climate, what I'm saying is, if you don't believe the science, you don't have to believe the science. That's all our own personal choice. But the next few slides, I want you to understand that it's not just, we used to think of farm programs as being a couple $100 million, right? This time around, it's going to be billions. There's billions of dollars have been earmarked. And the first one started here with the Inflation Reduction Act. $300 billion in energy security and climate change programs. Now that might mean more windmills, it might mean more solar panels, it's going to mean a lot of other things too. But of that $300 billion, there's $200 billion set aside for conservation programs. The first two that you're pretty familiar with would be CSP and EQIP. They're going to see huge increases in the amount of money that they want NRCS and so to push out the door. Now, Mary, I don't know how you're going to find enough people to help push those programs out, but you've heard that. It's coming. I think this year is about a $285 million payment. That's going to be their first 2023, $285 million coming out the door just for EQIP and CSP. There's going to be $10 billion for renewable energy and biofuels, including carbon capture and storage. And so the one that I think that you all should get excited about is sustainable aviation fuels. A lot of work going to be put towards that. 29 new crush plants being built in the United States or proposed to be built. Some of them are under construction, that the oil will be used for biodiesel. They would qualify under these programs. So as a soybean grower, are you all excited about having more people that want your beans? You should be. You should be. Sustainable aviation fuel, I've seen work on taking liquid manure from hog barns and through different processes actually be able to produce a sustainable aviation fuel. What else is behind sustainable aviation fuel? If you're an airline and you want to land your airplane in Europe, you will have renewable aviation fuel on board in the near future. Does United and all these companies not want to fly to Europe? Okay. So what always drives it's money, right? I mentioned carbon capture and storage, and I know some of you may have seen this slide or may understand what's going on, but for those who haven't, this is the state of Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota, and North Dakota. Anyone know what that picture really represents? There's a major pipeline being built, and it's going up to Bismarck, North Dakota. What is at the end? What are those little blue boxes? What's at the end there? What are those blue boxes? They're ethanol plants. What's the major byproduct of ethanol? CO2. Okay, so this is a major pipeline. There's 3 of them being built. One's going to Illinois. That's, I think, the Wolf Ridge project. This is Carbon Summit. The real controversy is the use of eminent domain against landowners who don't want the pipeline across their farm. That's been the major thing, and it's probably going to end up in the U.S. Supreme Court eventually. But Iowa, you got to understand, corn is definitely king there. But that's major thing. And there's going to be money in the Inflation Reduction Act for more of that. A new one, this is a new program that has just announced here within the last couple weeks. It's called, this is a USDA partnership for climate smart commodities. $3 billion for practices that you want to put out on the land that are deemed climate smart. And also $8 million in grants to monitor soil carbon and cover crops. So Sean, that's the $8 million we're going after, right? I'd rather have $3 billion in the kitty, but anyway, so the biggest thing, just watching a little bit of the, little bit about Farm Bill. Tried to watch a little bit. A lot of talk about how do we really measure it? How do we monitor it? It sounds like at least there's bipartisan agreement that we need a standardized process. And maybe that's where USDA and NRCS and Extension could have a really interesting part to play. USDA Smart Commodities Grants, this was a competitive grant process. The first tranche of payments went out, $2 billion for 70 pilot projects across the United States. What was really interesting about this was we generally think about competitive grants, land-grant universities being the lead authors on these. There was only like 2 or 3 of the 70 projects that a university was a lead author. Most of it was Iowa Corn Growers, Cargill, ADM, PepsiCo. It was really amazing the partnerships that were formed for this process. So an example, I know the grant, we weren't successful with ours, but we had an agreement. We were going to work with corn growers in Southwest Ohio to offer them a premium for corn that was grown climate smart. The corn was going to be used by the distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. We were going to have low carbon whiskey. That was one of our projects. So these companies took advantage of the ability to then use this $2 billion to incentivize farmers with a premium for the products and the commodities they raise. Farm Bill, I'd mentioned it earlier. Yeah, sides got drawn really quick in regards to crop insurance and the programs that benefit large CAFOs. So who's the chair of the Senate side, or the Democratic side? Who's the chair on the Ag Committee for the Democrats? Cory Booker, right? Cory Booker is on the Senate Ag Committee, and Cory doesn't like large CAFOs. So he doesn't like large ag. I don't know if he likes ag at all, but he's darn and determined he doesn't want to see methane digesters funded because they generally go to large CAFOs. It's awful hard for me to try to convince a 50-cow dairy to put a methane digester on their farm, okay? The Republicans are all about, we're not going to tie climate smart to crop insurance. There's a lot of people that want that in the next Farm Bill. So that's kind of the line that's been drawn in the sand to this point. But there is agreement on more climate-focused programs such as Conservation Security Program and EQIP. I don't know how much more we can push out there because, well, first of all, both these programs have waiting lists, okay? So we have more applicants than what we had money for in the past. So that's a positive. Again, the Democrats are more focused on smaller farms. That probably makes sense. So Farm Bill, you know, neither here nor there, but we will eventually get one. I've been kind of doing an open survey, and I don't know if that clock back here is correct or not, but yeah, so looking at farmers' attitudes toward carbon markets, I I don't know, I've got about 300 people in this data set, and about 7% of farmers just are not ready to participate for various reasons. Okay, so nationally, Purdue's study, Iowa State, they would all verify about the same number. We have about 3% adoption in carbon credit programs. I know 4 growers in my county that are signed on, 3 with Indigo and 1 with the Soil Outcomes Fund. 7 in 10 farmers feel that there should be credit for pre-existing practices, and it's very important for them to have that credit for them to participate. You know, they're stating their values here. But what do the carbon companies want? They want new carbon, right? They don't want something that's already been sequestered for the last 15 years if you're a long-term no-tiller. So long-term no-tillers, you know, they think they should participate. Well, additionality is the term the carbon companies are using. There's no additionality to that. There is talk about renting those farmers' carbon. There's just talk. Again, most farmers, and in my survey, say that the costs outweigh the benefits, and in some cases, it's a high investment for them in time and resources to adopt no-till and cover crops and split in your nitrogen applications and other things. So, again, going back to that slide earlier, you get what you pay for. The more you put in, the more you should get out. And then there's also the lack of farmers using farm management software systems. So how many in the room are using FieldView? Okay, 2, 3, maybe some of you didn't put your hands up. Anyone using Granular? Okay, what's some of the other ones, popular software? All right, but FieldView and Granular and a couple other ones are about the only ones that the carbon companies will accept. That's the ones they want you to use. Again, when you look at national data and census data, not a lot of farmers, they might have a yield monitor in the tractor, but not a lot of them are using it to its full capacity. And if you're going to participate in a carbon program, whether it be offsets or the inserts, you're going to share every farm practice that you do on the land that you enroll with the companies. And so that's how they generate their algorithm to try to predict the amount of carbon you've sequestered over a period of time. Most of the programs are in 5-year increments. So if you sign up with one of these companies, you're going to get a payment the first year. And let's just say $45 is, they're going to predict a ton. And so you're going to get a payment in the front end. And it's a little loaded, heavy loaded on the front end to encourage you and at least help you make the transition, and then over the period of 5 years, and then it's renewed again. Most of the companies will do a soil sample on the front end, okay, and then they're going to do one about every 5 years. The real goal for the companies is to get a bunch of you and your neighbors to all enroll, and there may be someone in your neighborhood getting sampled. You're going to be put into an aggregation. Because how this is done is that they look at your tillage practices, whether you're using no-till, they're looking at yield, because they understand what you take off the farm, but weather plays one of the biggest parts of the equation. So if you're using like Comment, which is an NRCS developed program, you can go in today, click your state, click your county, and you can start kind of trying to predict the amount of carbon that you sequester over a period of time. Some of the companies are using Common, but some of them are using their own. And that's the other thing. There's just no standardization across all these companies. So again, I think sometimes farmers are a little hesitant to sign on when they don't know how the payment's being generated. But I will tell you, the algorithm gets good the more data that you put into it. Climate View, I remember when we had Climate View, I had it on my phone, And every time I went into the farm, I'd look to see how much rain I got the night before. I had a rain gauge, right? So I would look, and the phone told me I got 4/10. The rain gauge told me I had 6/10. So I would correct it every time. All right, guess what? Climate View got pretty good after about 3 years. The correction factor. So the more data points, the better the algorithm. And I guess kind of thinking about why farmers haven't adopted this as widely as we thought they would initially is sometimes, this was a quote I got from a farmer, says sometimes farmers always focus on the amount written on the check when they are unsure of the purchase or the practice. And I think that's kind of where we are today. And I got another quote here in a minute, but who is a good candidate for any of these programs, whether it be an offset or an inset? It's a producer who wants to make the changes in his system, regardless if there's a payment or not. They see the benefits of no-till. They see the benefits of cover crops. They understand the benefits of splitting your nitrogen or maybe reducing your nitrogen rate. Those are the kind of people that make really good candidates for these programs. So I always kind of think of it as just kind of think of the carbon payment as the cherry on top of the sundae. The program has to fit your overall goals, land management goals. Think about the multiple benefits, whether it be clean water, wildlife, songbirds, pollinators. There's a lot of other benefits that come along to some of the things these companies are trying to get you to or convince you to do. I mentioned all these food companies that are potentially coming out here to contract with you to raise low carbon commodities. If you're already in a carbon offset program, and I know Indigo is one of these companies only because I sat on a panel with one of their reps in Omaha a few months ago, they've recognized that you're going to have other opportunities on how you use, with your commodities, what you raise. So if you've enrolled in an Indigo program, and I'm sure some of the other companies are going to do the same, they're going to let you time out. So Sean, if you're getting $25 a ton for your carbon, but General Mills comes to you and says, I'll give you $2 a bushel more for your wheat, and that is more than the $25 a ton carbon payment, Indigo is going to let you step out of the program and take advantage of that. So what I'm saying is only 3% of farmers have adopted this. The companies are starting to realize that we're going to have to change a little bit to get farmers to enroll. And again, I mentioned you better have good digital records and be comfortable with your data being shared, because that's how the payments are all going to get divvied out. My suggestion too, if you're really considering this, use that look back provision to work out the kinks. Most of the companies will give you a 5-year look back. So if you've only been no-tilling for 5 years, or you've only been into cover crops for like 3 years, these companies will give you that credit or that look back period. So I guess my advice is, if you're going to consider especially the offset market, and you've never no-tilled, and you've never cover cropped, why don't you learn how to do that before you enroll in the program? Okay, so use the look back provision. Some companies are a little more generous. Some are 7, some are 10. So, read the kind. I know Peggy's going to talk about that. Peggy's going to talk about the legal side of these programs, but use the look back to work the kinks out. So this is a quote from Mariah Murphy. She's the senior manager at Truterra, one of the big carbon credit companies. They're working with Cenex Harvest States. That's their biggest client. They're working with all the farmers up in Minnesota and Wisconsin. She thinks that the future carbon markets will continue to evolve over the next few years, but we're still going to be in a messy place. And so I think it's a pretty good definition of where we are right now. That's my last slide. Any questions?